Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS Semifinals overview and analysis video here in the Spring Split. And you know what that means. This is the second to last series of the LCS Spring Split. We are coming up on the finals very shortly. I'm filming this just a couple of hours before the finals end up kicking off. This should be out before the finals end up starting, so hopefully you guys can either watch it before or after the series. But this is a big one. This is to determine the second team to represent North America at MSI. This is to determine who's going to be making finals. There is a lot on the line, and both of these teams, I think, are coming at this from very different perspectives. One is expecting to win this series and really needs to be able to go to the finals, and the other, I think, would be very happy if they won this series and were heading to the finals. But we'll talk all about that as we continue on in the video. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. Did this series live up to your expectations, or did it not? If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the playoffs and the LCS so far, you can check out the videos up in the iCard. That's going to be all of the playoff videos, round 1 and round 2, kind of going over everything that we've seen so far from the LCS. It's been a really fun playoff run. I think for basically every team, there's been some upsets, there's been some predictable outcomes, but generally, I think a lot of teams have shown good things over the course of the playoffs, maybe with a few exceptions, and the games have been very fun, so I would recommend you check those videos out. If you haven't, you're going to be kind of lost in terms of context if you haven't, but we are going to only be talking about the semifinals today, the lower bracket finals, if you will, because we know the team that's going to be in the finals waiting for them. FlyQuest, of course, winning the winners finals, being the team that's going to be, facing whoever wins today, and they're going to be watching this series closely because both of these teams have a lot to offer. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 3 seeded Cloud9 and the number 4 seeded Team Liquid. This is a very intriguing matchup on paper. Both of these teams, like I said, coming at this, I think, from very different perspectives. Cloud9, the odds-on favorite to win this split by everybody going into the year. They just have not been able to live up to expectations so far. It felt like they were going to be a team that got it together in playoffs because they have the most talented roster in the league, but things have just not worked out for them. They ended up getting absolutely blown out by FlyQuest. That series was not particularly close in any way. It was a 3-0 sweep, and there are a lot of problems with this team. I think in particular how they play the game. I know that feels very broad, but like their play style as opposed to their individual mechanics, I think have been a bit of a problem. I think identifying win conditions and trying to play towards win cons that aren't the most obvious one that they've played through all year have been a bit of a problem. Jojo Pune has been a centralizing player for Cloud9. He has been the player that this entire team has run their offense through for all of 2024, and Jojo's the best player on the team, so that definitely tracks and it makes sense, but the problem is that teams have kind of figured that out, that Jojo is so important, and he really is one of those players that just kind of attracts a lot of resources in the mid lane, and so if you put a lot of attention and resources into shutting him down, like FlyQuest did, all of a sudden, can anyone else on this team actually beat you? And to say that about Berserker and Fudge and Blabber, like that's not a good sentence to be able to say. They absolutely should be able to beat every other team with those players. That's what they were doing last year. They didn't have Jojo last year. They had Eminus, who was a significantly worse version of what Jojo is right now, and they were still able to win almost everything with the exception of finals. And so to see this team kind of fall off in terms of consistency outside of playing through mid lane, it certainly is a concern from a playstyle perspective. I think part of that is draft. This team has really indexed heavily into trying to give Jojo a lot of aggressive picks in the mid lane and not necessarily going for those aggressive picks in other lanes, and especially when teams do target Jojo, that means that there really aren't a lot of other win conditions. Specifically, Blabber has been on tanks for almost the entirety of the playoffs, and I heavily disagree with that decision, especially if teams are going to be focusing mid. You need to get Blabber on something that can impact the map more. That's what I said was going to be the biggest influence on whether or not Cloud9 could actually win this series or not. Blabber, to me, is the most important player in this series, but their expectations are, at the very least, finals. They need to make MSI. If they don't make MSI, if they don't make top 2, that is an absolute disaster for them after the roster that they were able to put together this offseason. But on the flip side of that, you've got Team Liquid, who I think is very happy to be here. Not to say that they're, like, shocked that they're here. I think they felt like they could be a top 2, top 3 team in the LCS this split, but I don't think a lot of analysts or a lot of pundits would have agreed at the beginning of the split, me included. I think that there were obviously positives to this team. Impact is a great player, and you were hoping that Umti could come over and actually play the NA style really well because he is a good early game jungler, even if he is a horrendous team fighter. And so you're sitting here and you're saying, okay, well, there's pieces here that you can build around to potentially stay relevant, but APA was certainly a question mark. Yon, a player I really like, wasn't, universally loved, and Core JJ had kind of been on the downward trajectory, I would say, going into the year, but all of that has kind of flipped in the playoffs, even after a really rough regular season, in my opinion. Impact has been great, but it's been Yeon and Core JJ to me that have been the standouts for Team Liquid. They've been the best laning bot lane in North America, and it's not been particularly close. Yeon in particular has been a star for Team Liquid so far in the playoffs. APA has stepped up and beaten basically everybody that he's come into contact with, including the MVP in Quid in 1v1s in the mid lane. Umti's been very solid, even if I do think he's been kind of the least remarkable player on this team in terms of their runs so far. I think it's just all going right for Team Liquid, but that kind of highlights a little bit of the conundrum here, where Team Liquid's definitely got more momentum. They're hotter going into this series, but their expectations and their general, talent level is lower than Cloud9. And so do you take the team that's hotter but maybe isn't quite as good, or do you take the team that's on a cold streak even though they should theoretically be better? My prediction was Cloud9 in 4. That was what I expected this series to be in my preview at the end of last episode. Obviously, both of these teams are very interesting in their own right, and I would not be shocked if Team Liquid came out and played really well, but Cloud9 should be the favorites here. They are rightfully going to be the favorites, and if they lose this, they're going to be disappointed, and that's where I wanted to make my prediction. If Cloud9 loses this, they're going to feel hard done by themselves, and they would have earned not making MSI, but it's definitely going to be an interesting series. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and then obviously we will preview the finals at the end of this episode, talk about the two teams that remain and who I think could become the LCS champion. But if we're going game by game, that means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Team Liquid. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a big win. Game 1 is very important in a best of 5 because generating that momentum and confidence is key, and obviously, generally, it's going to be important, but even more so, I think, for this matchup, where you have two teams that kind of are on opposite directions in terms of the momentum spectrum, where Team Liquid has looked very good throughout the playoffs, significantly better than expected, and significantly better than they did in the regular season, whereas Cloud9 has looked worse. I mean, they didn't look great in the regular season, but they have certainly underperformed. To see Liquid come out and beat them in game number 1 to keep that momentum rolling, that is a big sign that things could be shifting in a series like this. Obviously, it's just game 1. You're not going to freak out too much if you're a Cloud9 fan, because if you win that game number 2, all of a sudden it becomes a best of 3, and you've proven that you can beat the team. Things aren't over by any stretch, but this is certainly something to keep an eye on if you are a C9 fan. Team Liquid looked great in game number 1, and they played around a player that they really haven't played around a lot this year, that being, in my opinion, Umti in the jungle, who is going to get player of the game on the Jax. Umti's been fine this year. I certainly don't want it to come across like I hate Umti or I think he's not playable at this level or anything like that. I just think he's not like an all-pro caliber player. He has not been a top 3, top 4 jungler in NA for me across this split. I think he's been fine, but Impact and Yeon and Core JJ have really been the stars for me in terms of why this team is winning a lot of their games. Umti's just kind of been along for the ride, and his teamfight struggles have absolutely continued, but man, when his early games hit, they hit. And we'll talk about the Cloud9 draft. Maokai jungle, no thank you. I talked very extensively about how I think if Cloud9 continues to go to these tank, more passive junglers, they're just not going to win in the early game. Blabber has too much influence on the map and too much of a responsibility to be able to keep up, that when Jax is going mid lane over and over again and attacking the immobile Orianna, you have to have someone else on the map that can actually step up and be more of a macro presence. That's going to have to be Blabber, but when he's playing Maokai, he's just never really going to have the option to do that. Umti very much took advantage of that, was very aggressive in the early game on a champion that you wouldn't necessarily think would be great in that stage, but got snowballed so quickly that by the time you hit 10-15 minutes into this game, the Jax was undealable with. Like, he was so ridiculously strong. Umti was phenomenal in these team fights, and it was really difficult to end up winning this for Cloud9. Impact and Yeon, the players I've been hyping up, they were also very good here. I don't think Fudge was particularly bad in this game on Renekton. We'll talk about him the rest of this series, but Impact was really solid. His team fighting is always very consistent on champions like Kasante, on champions like anything. He's just a great team fighter. It's what Impact is known for, and Yeon and Core can't lose lane if their life depended on it. Varus Zyra is obviously a very aggressive lane. It's supposed to be something that can actually deal with Kalista Renata, which we really haven't seen be beaten all that consistently in the meta, but Yeon and Core are better individually as players right now than Berserker and Vulcan, which is certainly not something I expected to say going into the year, but it's just kind of the truth. They were better in this game. They've been better throughout this year. APA, a little bit over-aggressive, I think, as all chatting definitely brings some attention and draws some resources his way from the enemy team, but for the most part, it was honestly worth it with him drawing drawing a lot of that pressure to allow, you know, the Varus and the Jax to actually be able to scale into the mid game and make these team fights a lot easier because you got your resources on the proper carries and not on the Ziggs in the mid lane. So credit to Liquid. I thought they played this game really well. There were a lot of things to like about it from their side, but the same cannot be said for Cloud9 on the other side, who just really can't get the hint right now. To me, it is very obvious that drafting Maokai Orianna as your jungle mid duo, it's just not the play. Drafting in a mobile mage in the mid lane that's just going to get dove under tower all game by a Ziggs and a Jax and a Cassante, it's just not the move I would have picked. And then also giving Blabber something that he can't be proactive on in the early game is also not the play, in my opinion. I get that, like, Nocturne was banned out, and maybe you wanted to play Nocturne Orianna, but where's Lee Sin? Like, where's Xin Zhao? Where are these picks that can actually do something early on in games? I think Blabber being on Maokai is genuinely a massive hindrance for how Cloud9 wants to play, because it's clear the side lanes are just not going to win you games. Fudge was okay here. He certainly wasn't a disaster. In fact, I think you can make an argument that he was the best performing player here in game number 1, but Berserker and Vulcan have not won lane. Like, all playoffs, they have just not been good. I don't know who to blame. You know, Vulcan's kind of got a history now of coming into teams, super teams, and having them underperform. Whether or not you think that's his fault or, you know, the fault of something else, it's up to you. But Berserker was amazing last year, clear-cut the #1 player in North America going into the year, and he has been a non-factor for Cloud9 all year long. He's not even been really all that bad. He's not making crazy mistakes. He's just, like, not existing. He's playing Kalista and losing lane. It's really disappointing to see this bot lane doesn't click. And so when JoJo, really the only player who's carried any games for you across this year, is not playing well like he did in this one, he got targeted a lot, he's going to get dead of the game, and you have Blabber on Maokai, all of a sudden you really don't have a win condition. You just kind of slowly bleed out and lose the game like you did here in game 1. It's the same thing that happened against FlyQuest, and they never adapted in that series, and they're not adapting now in this series. One of the biggest problems that Cloud9 has had over the course of, I honestly want to say, like, the last, 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer than that, going back to about 2019, is that they just fail to be able to keep up in terms of macro with other teams around them. They've always been so much more mechanically talented than everybody else that they're playing, but as soon as they get to international tournaments and they play other mechanically talented teams, it's clear that their decision-making and their ability to play the map is just significantly lagging behind. Well, now, mechanically, they're not keeping up. They're underperforming what you would expect in terms of the 1v1s or the 2v2s, and they're still bad at the macro game, which means they're losing situations like this. This is not a good League of Legends team in their current state. They have to figure something out. But again, it's just game number 1. If they can win game 2, if they can be a lot more clean, then things are going to feel a bit better. I just need to see some adaptations from a team that has essentially refused to do so all year long. And then for Team Liquid, this is a great win. If you can win game 2, talk about the confidence and the momentum that you will have generated there. This team is obviously really looking to make finals against the grain here, and they've done a really good job to set themselves up for that in game number 1, but are they going to be able to keep it up, or is Cloud9 going to be able to tie up this series? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and this is where panic really starts to set in for Cloud9, because, yeah, we talked about how going down 2-0 would have been a disaster, but at the very least, if you had made the same mistakes, if you had failed to adapt, then you could, at best, like, hold some false notion of hope in your head that games 3, 4, and 5, they would figure out the adaptation, they would go to it, and it would work, and they would win this series, and they would go on to win finals, and everything would be all hunky-dory. But now we're sitting here at the end of game number 2, they're down 0-2, and they did make the adjustment. This is almost identical to the draft I would want them to have, a weak side bot lane with a really good combo that lets, Tom and Senna really excel in a lot of situations. I think this is the best Senna lane in the game. A mid laner that can be resourceful without a lot of resources, that doesn't necessarily need the game to be played around him in order for it to work, and a jungler that can be proactive in the early game for Blabber. This is everything I could have asked for from the Cloud9 draft, and they got slaughtered. Like, they were not good enough to be able to win this, and now that's panic mode. Like, that is concern. If the concern was that they were failing to adapt and that these players were solid, but they were not being given a chance, well, they were given a pretty good chance in this game, and they just didn't do anything with it. TL was better, and it was very clear to see. For Team Liquid on the other side, this is massive to prove that you really are just not only on the level of Cloud9, but perhaps way ahead of the level of Cloud9 in your current state. It just goes to show you that this playoff run has not been a fluke, that this has not been, them just gaining enough confidence to be able to overperform their talent level. They deserve to be here, and they deserve to be here all year long. It took them a little bit to find their playstyle, but once they locked in towards the end of the regular season, once they realized they could put Yan and Core on things that could scale into the late game and they would still win lane and you could play for other places on the map, all of a sudden this team became very explosive and very difficult to deal with in the mid game, and it's been very impressive. Player of the game was so difficult because I think so many players played well for Team Liquid. This was a bit of an everything gap when it came to TL, in my opinion, with how this game went down, but I'm going to give it to Impact in the top lane, if only because I think top lane was the most noticeable gap. We'll talk about Fudge a little bit later. That one was less difficult to determine a dud of the game. But Impact was also excellent. He did a lot of really good things on the Rumble. This champion just fits his style so well because he can still exert pressure in the early game while being that pivotal, game-breaking team fighter because of that ultimate. And so it really allows Impact to play more aggressive, and it allows him to play as a strong side carry, which is something that Team Liquid has pretty frequently wanted to at least attempt over the course of this year. Whether or not they've done it consistently is up to interpretation, but I think playing for Impact is obviously a great idea. Typically speaking, you would say that Impact's laning phase is the weakest part of his game. That's kind of been his career profile, is that he is the best team fighter in North America, but, you know, sometimes he will struggle in lane against really talented opponents in mechanical matchups. That has not been the case in 2024. He's almost completely turned that on its head. Not that he's been a bad team fighter, but rather he's just been a really good laner in 2024, which I think is very good to see. You know, Impact on a new team, his first split on a new team, it's basically always how it goes. He always steps it up in year one, and this year has been no different. But again, you could give it to a lot of different players. I think Yan and Core were excellent in this game. Yan's positioning is just exceptional in terms of how he's able to execute in lane. He's just better than everybody that he's going against right now in terms of knowing matchups, knowing how to play them out. He clearly knows the meta very well. Do I think that might translate into the best bot laners in the world? I'm really not sure of that. I think that it might be a pretty rough matchup in that case because his inherent mechanical floor is a little bit lower than you would say, but man, right now he is just beating people. It's very fun to watch. He has been excellent throughout this playoff run. Core JJ, a big part of that as well. His laning, you know, prowess, I think, has increased so much. He was always known as a roamer. He was always known as somebody who would leave his AD carry on an island for him to go out and really make a lot of plays around the map, a big macro influencer, but this team has invested a lot into the 2v2 in the bot lane, and Core has actually really stepped up and been a positive in that state in this year, which he wasn't last year, so big ups to him. APA was excellent in this game. Honestly, he was just better than Jojo Pune, who was solid on the other side of this matchup. They didn't invest a ton of resources into shutting him down, and he was the most valuable player for Cloud9. Shout out to the Cloud9 fans who are constantly like, we need a new mid laner. They're not watching. Like, if you watch these games and think that Jojo is the biggest problem on this team, I don't really know what to tell you. We'll get to that in a second, but APA was excellent in this game on the Tristana. Did receive some help in the mid game to allow that scoreline to get up a little bit. I'm not trying to say that he was perfect, but he was certainly very good, and that's all you really need him to be in this matchup. And Umti was solid too. No real major mistakes, but this was a group effort from Team Liquid. They were better across the board. Their macro was better, their decision making was better, and their mechanics were better. It's just a gap right now, and that's really not good for Cloud9. That is almost the worst thing that you could possibly hear as a Cloud9 fan, is a bit of an everything gap. Fudge is a clear choice for dead of the game, and he is going to receive a lot of criticism online because people love to scapegoat Fudge. You know, generally with popular teams, there are scapegoats, and I'm not saying Fudge is like undeserving of criticism. I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's a perfect player, but I do think that obviously he gets significantly more criticism than he deserves. He's consistently been a top 3, at worst, top laner in North America, and I get that the expectation is for him to be top 1, but he earned it in this game. Like, the criticism that he got, he's gonna earn it here because Impact just mega outplayed him. This was not particularly close. I think the concerning part is that Jojo did play well. Berserker wasn't making mistakes even if he wasn't active, and the rest of this team just couldn't do anything. Blabber is just not playing well right now. There's nothing else to say. The Lee Sin was too inactive. They actually did lose pressure early. He was attempting to make plays, but you gotta be able to try and force the issue here as Cloud9. You have to just try and skill check the enemy team, and Blabber, I think, was a little bit too passive in terms of how I would have played out this early game on the Lee Sin. Vulcan has just not been good this year. There's really nothing else to say. He's not even really been a league average support. I think at times he's been league average, but for the most part, he's been slightly below average as a support here in North America, which is majorly disappointing. And Berserker, like I said, on the Senna is just not doing anything. This is a champion that you hope can scale into the late game, and maybe you can play aggressive here, but Yan and Core are generating so much tempo and momentum in the early game that it's really not useful to have this Senna because you're not scaling. For Cloud9, you're down 0-2 and you're not in a particularly good position right now. Winning 3 in a row is hard against anybody, but Team Liquid is white hot at the current moment with just as much confidence as you could possibly have. For Cloud9 to get back on track, they're going to need to not only prove to us, but prove to themselves that they can win a series like this. I think comfort is essential here, and for Liquid, they're playing excellent. They just need to be able to close it out. Obviously, you've got some buffers here being up 2-0, but you don't want to give Cloud9 any chance to get themselves back into it mentally. You want to shut down this series as quickly as possible. So is Team Liquid going to be able to close it out, or is Cloud9 going to be, at the very least, able to take a game in this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to clean sweep this series, which I don't think anybody saw coming. I know that there were some on the broadcast that predicted this, but oh my god, like, this is insane how not there Cloud9 was in this series, how not good this was from Cloud9, and how good this was from Team Liquid, how well they played throughout the entirety of this series. You just have to give them a lot of kudos. They played excellent League of Legends today. They really outplayed their opponents. You can talk about the individual, decisions and plays that they ended up making towards the end of game 2 to end up winning that game. Cloud9 wasn't in the worst of spots, but really, Team Liquid never felt in danger at any point in this series. They never felt like they weren't the better team out of these two, and to go into a series against Cloud9, kind of the biggest super team on paper, in my opinion, that NA has had, and to just destroy them, to really kind of show that they have not lived up to those expectations, it's really impressive stuff for TL. For Cloud9, this is obviously a disaster. Losing here is worst case scenario, but it's not even just losing here. It's the last 2 series, you got 3-0'd. You went 0-6 in your final 6 games of the spring split. That is a disaster. You're not going to MSI. You are not one of the top 2 teams in North America. And if you would have told me that at the beginning of the year, that would have been one of the biggest underperformances in North American history. And I do believe that this is one of the biggest underperformances in North American history. There is going to have to be some accountability, maybe some changes. We'll talk about that when we get to Cloud9. But for Team Liquid, congratulations to them. They are moving on to the finals. They're moving on to MSI. They've qualified for an international so early on into this process. I do not think this collection of 5 players was expected to do so, obviously, and so to get there has to feel good, but they did it in a very commanding way. Player of the game and player of the series here for me is going to go to Impact. I think you could give this to a couple of players. I think this is more spread out than people are going to say, but Impact was probably the most impactful player on this roster. I think the reason that I've been maybe a little bit lower, quote unquote, on Impact than other people, I still think at worst he's like a top 2 top laner in North America, but the reason I've been a little bit less on the bandwagon is because I think that this team is playing well in areas that aren't for Impact as well. Like, I think this team just doesn't get enough credit in general in terms of how well, like, the bot lane and the mid lane are playing right now, and Jungle, I think, had a really great series. It was very in favor of Team Liquid across the board, but Impact was the most noticeable player. I just think I take a little bit of umbrage with the idea that he's the only player playing well, which you do sometimes see kind of talked about on social media. I don't think that's true, but he is still a very important member of what Team Liquid is doing. He was a second-team All-Pro member for me in the regular season for a reason. He's been excellent, and man, the outplay in this game was ridiculous to watch. Essentially, taking a 1v3 in the top lane and trading 1 for 0, not even dying in the exchange, is genuinely absurd. He is just better than Cloud9, and that was very clear here. Obviously, his former organization, it had to feel pretty good to be the one to end up outplaying them and really putting his team ahead, but everybody else played well. I thought APA had a phenomenal series. Jojo Pyun is an excellent player, and even though he really hadn't been playing in form recently, because I think a lot of the attention he had been getting mid lane had really, kind of hurt his confidence, and generally I think he didn't feel as comfortable stepping up and playing aggressive because he was getting punished a lot for that throughout the end of the regular season. I think APA took advantage of that and was honestly great in this series. He has been great in the last 3 series that this team has played. He has truly become one of the more interesting mid lane options in North America. I get it. It's on Ziggs, and he played 2 Ziggs games this series, and small champion pool, yada, yada, yada. If you're not going to ban it, you can't complain about it. Really, at the end of the day, that's the case. I think APA has proven that he can still be very relevant on things like Talia. That's why it was permaban throughout this series, is because he's better on things, or he's as good on things like Talia as he is on Aurelion and on Ziggs. And, the champion pool has grown a bit wider, and it's always been a bit wider than people give him credit for. But he was excellent in this series. I thought was very good. We'll talk about Blabber, but it was not close. was the better jungler of these two in this series. What is it with Team Liquid junglers and showing up in the playoffs when it matters the most and not so much in the regular season? Very funny how that's just kind of become an organizational trend, but it very much continued here. And you guys know my thoughts on Yeon and Core. They were the better bot lane by a considerable margin, and both of them were very good here. But Team Liquid across the board was just better than Cloud9. They outplayed them, they outclassed them, they had a better game plan, and they're going to finals, they're going to MSI because of it. Congratulations to this team. They've earned all of the praise that they are going to get. And then for C9, disaster has struck. There is no real other way to put it. This is worst case scenario, missing MSI, missing finals. There's just no excuse. There is no excuse for this roster not to be there, and especially for them to go out on 2 back-to-back 0-3s against FlyQuest and Team Liquid, 2 teams that, as much as I like both of them and as much as they are playing well right now, should not be able to go 3-0 against Cloud9. This is an underperformance, and there are a lot of fingers to point, a lot of blame to be, put on this team in multiple different areas. Obviously, you can put it in a lot of different places. Everybody shares at least a little bit of it. I think JoJo is probably the least big culprit of this team because he was really the one that got them here in the first place, and so it's hard to really point to him as the problem, but everybody else I really do think deserves a lot of negatives. Dud of the game is going to go to Blabber in Game 3. He was awful in this series. I talked about how he needed to play things like Xin Zhao and Lee Sin in this series so that this team could unlock a lot of their early game a bit more, but he did play those champions, and he was bad, and that's concerning, is that Blabber really has not been that guy this year. He had a couple of really good performances in the regular season, a couple of really good showings in games, but he also had a couple of really bad ones, and his playoff run was not good. That's a real concern moving into the rest of this split. Blabber and JoJo maybe aren't going to be that dynamic mid-lane duo, mid-jungle duo, I should say, that they were at the beginning of spring, which is concerning. Fudge just got outplayed in the top lane. I still think Fudge is generally fine, but he was bad in this series. I think he is the same player he's always been. He's going to crush players that he is inherently better than, which is a lot of North America, and so you're going to win a lot of games through Fudge, but he's going to lose to players that he is not better than, like Impact and like Blippo, as we've seen throughout the last couple of playoff series. I think it's just kind of what you have to take with Fudge. Whether or not you think that upside is too low for you, I think is up to your interpretation. There are free agent top laners out there like Licorice that I think could be interesting additions, but that's not the area I'm looking at. The first person I'm calling is Sven. I'm saying, please, please, please role swap to support. Please stay at support. Come back in and play for us, because whatever happened to Berserker this split, you have to rectify it. Berserker has been sensational for Cloud9 ever since he came over a couple of years ago, and this year, it just completely fell off. He never felt comfortable. It didn't feel like his partnership with Vulcan was working out at all, and Vulcan's not been individually good enough to justify the fact that clearly your AD carry is playing worse without the player that he had publicly stated he was most comfortable playing with of anybody he's played with in pro in his entire career. If you need to beg Sven to come back here, then that's what you have to do, but to me, that feels like such an obvious phone call to make because Vulcan and Berserker are just not getting it done. And like I said, JoJo was generally fine. He wasn't the worst player in this series, but I also do think this was maybe the worst series he played all playoffs long, including the FlyQuest one, where he was dud of the game almost every single game. At least in that one, he was being targeted. He was getting 3-manned every single game in the mid lane. In this one, he was just kind of not relevant in the 1v1, which is certainly more disappointing. It's just not a good series at all for Cloud9, and one of the most disappointing ends to a playoff run that I can remember. Them not going international, I think, is really going to haunt them, and things have to be different and have to be better in summer. To me, coaching is the first place that I'm going to look. I hate scapegoating coaching. I think that that's a horrible thing to do because obviously we don't know, what these coaches are doing, what they're talking about, what is the player, what is the coach. It's hard to really know, but this has been a consistent trend for Cloud9 that they've underperformed their talent level in terms of their macro and their preparation and their decision-making, not only with this coaching staff, but with previous coaching staffs. I think you need to clean house here if you're Cloud9. I think you need new faces in here, new ideas in here that could reinvigorate it. That would also be the first thing that I would do. That and Sven, those are the first two calls I'm making. But for Team Liquid, congratulations again. You just have to be excited for a team that nobody really had expectations for, that didn't have some sort of fantastic regular season. I certainly was low on them coming into the playoffs. I had them losing to Dignitas in the lower bracket. I didn't have them winning a single playoff series in my predictions, but here they are in the finals at MSI, and they've earned every single bit of it. Every single one of these players has stepped up, and you've just got to be proud for this team as a whole. But that's going to be it for my coverage of this series. It's time to very quickly preview the LCS finals. Now that we know the two teams that are going to be making it, let's talk about what I think is going to happen in that series. Of course, it is a matchup between the number 1 seeded FlyQuest and the number 4 seeded Team Liquid, a very intriguing matchup on paper, and we've already seen this matchup. This was the first round matchup, the first series, or the second series, I guess technically, that we got in the playoffs. We saw FlyQuest go over, but it was a 5-game series. It's been the only team to take a game off of FlyQuest in the playoffs. Of course, they've only played 2 series, but this could be a fun one. Team Liquid was very close to being able to take that series. Honestly, for bits and pieces of that first series, they were the better team, and they were able to play through their win conditions very well. And in that series, what ended up being a huge positive for Liquid was the bot lane. It was Yan and it was Core JJ, who were just significantly better than Masu and Busio when it came to the individual 2v2 in lane. Masu and Busio really aren't a focal point for what FlyQuest want to do. They are much more focused on their veterans on the top side of the map. Inspired is the one generating a lot of pressure, and Bwipo and Jensen are very good at being able to capitalize on that. They play for Void Grubs, and they play to try and generate topside pressure and just leave bot lane on a weak side. That's really kind of been the game plan for Fly. But Team Liquid is one of the kinds of teams that could take advantage of that in a pretty major way. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that because Masu and Busio are very good, and if FlyQuest is expecting that and they just play weak side, on the bot side they play very safe, they don't really overextend, then I think you're going to be in an okay spot to at least trade back a lot of objectives and be able to trust that you can outfight Team Liquid in the late game. But if you're looking for an avenue for success for Liquid, I think Yan and Core in the bot lane are probably going to be your focal points, and then obviously Impact in the top lane. The only reason that I talk about Impact a little bit less in this series is because Bwipo is also great. These are the two best top laners in North America right now, going head-to-head in the finals. That's what you want to see. Obviously, top lane is a role that sometimes feels less impactful. These two players have not made it feel like that over the course of this year. Both of them have been exceptional, and Bwipo, I think, has really been a carry. Impact has been more of whatever the team needs him to be. Whoever you want to favor in that matchup, I think, is generally fair. I'm going to slightly favor Bwipo because I think he's been better over the course of the whole year, at least more of a focal point for what FlyQuest wants to do, and I think Impact as a player in the past has at least struggled with very aggressive and smart laners in terms of, mechanics, and so it's not necessarily happened in the playoffs. I'm not going to sit here and say that Impact's been bad in any way and that I expect him to lose, but Bwipo has been exceptional, and I think both of these players will probably play well in this series. Where I do think you start to generate some advantages for FlyQuest is the jungle mid duo, and this is really where I think Team Liquid has to prove that they can keep this momentum up, because APA and Umti were very good in this series. APA has been good all playoffs long, and even if I'm lower on the output that Umti has offered, I don't think he's been exceptional for this team, certainly the player that has stood out the least to me. Inspired and Jensen are going to be favorites in that matchup going into this series. Inspired is arguably the best jungler in North America right now, I think, especially with Blabber underperforming. I think that's a pretty clear case for me. River is certainly in that conversation as well, but I would take Inspired over any of them at the current moment. He's just so consistent. He can carry games. He's the best team-fighting jungler in the region, and I don't even think it's really all that close, and he's really good at enabling his laners as well. Great at controlling objectives. Just a very well-rounded jungler. He's succeeded at every level he's played at for a reason. And then Jensen's obviously having a career resurgence here on FlyQuest. Probably his best split since he left Cloud9 in 2017, the first time around. Not even the second time, the first time around. And so you're expecting those two to be better than players like Umti and APA, who have been a little bit more inconsistent throughout the entirety of the year. But again, Team Liquid's burning hot right now. They are white hot in terms of the momentum that they have been generating. If APA shows up like he did against Jojo Pune, Jensen, could definitely fall. And especially, with the rivalry that these two have, I imagine both of them are going to be pretty fired up to take on this series. And then Umti, he can win any game so long as he's active in the early game, so long as he's actually able to generate momentum. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult to do that against Inspired than the disheveled Cloud9, I will definitely say. And so there definitely is a favorite in this series for me. I think FlyQuest is the better of these two teams, and they won the last time around, but Team Liquid is hotter than they were the last time around. I think they have a clearer play style than they did the last time they were around. And I think generally these players are playing significantly better. So I think this will be a fun series. If Liquid takes it, I'm not going to be stunned, but FlyQuest are pretty heavy favorites for me going into this. I certainly would expect them to walk out as the winners, but it really is all up to interpretation. And this is going to be a fun series no matter what, I think. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS semifinals overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. It's just the finals left. That's all we've got left for us here in the LCS in North America. It's happening later today, about an hour and a half from when I'm finishing recording this, and I'm very excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to be walking out of this series as LCS champions? Would love to know, especially if you're watching this before the series, obviously, but let me know how you feel about the LCS as a whole down there as well. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCS, we post about the NACL as well on this channel tier 2, and finals are coming up for them as well, so very excited to talk about that. But the LEC, LPL, LCK, all of their playoffs are right around the corner. They've started, at least in terms of the games. We're going to be covering them on this channel, and of course, MSI is right around the corner. We'll be covering that as well, so if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all